Hi there, my name is Chris Wicks. I'm based out of Edinburgh in Scotland. I work for Accenture. I've worked for Accenture for about 7 years. Most of that time I've worked on all things conversational AI. And a few years ago, I ended up falling into the world of conversation design. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, is why you should consider becoming a conversation designer too. If we start with just a bit of background so everyone knows what I'm talking about, conversational AI is appearing in more and more aspects of everyone's daily life. And by conversational AI, we mean any kind of conversational user interface. So you'll be familiar with common things like Siri on the iPhone, with Amazon Alexa, with Google Assistant. So they're all examples of kind of virtual personal assistants. But then you also have in-vehicle assistants. We also have the kind of chatbots that you often have for customer service on a website. More and more companies are using conversational AI for their IT support, for staff, also for HR support. And there's even been in recent years a bunch of chatbots launched to support people with their mental health. So conversational AI seems to be here to stay, and it's not going anywhere. And people's usage of these systems continues to increase as well. So some statistics here from a survey by Algorithmia that showed that 128 million people in the US used a voice assistant daily in 2020. 74% of the people that they interviewed in 2020 say that they use conversational assistants for researching or buying products and services. 40% of those now using voice assistants have started doing so since 2020. So there's been a big uptick there. And around 20% of patents in conversational assistants are related with training or educating. So again, some more use cases there. But I did mention there that a lot of people have started using these since 2020. The pandemic with COVID-19 was a bit of a tipping point in the adoption of conversational AI. Certainly the type of work that we do in Accenture, we saw a massive surge in demand around the kickoff of the pandemic. And one of the reasons for that is because obviously these companies were slammed with people trying to contact them. Their customer support channels were being absolutely overwhelmed. So the demand to automate some of that contact through things like chatbots or voice assistants was really strong. And actually, some research by Accenture has shown that since COVID, 77% of consumers expect to sustain an increased level of usage of live chat, chatbots, and voice assistants. So like I said, it's a bit of a tipping point, and people were pushed into using these systems. And now that they're a bit more familiar with them, people intend to keep using them. However, from a user experience point of view, chatbots don't have the best reputation. A lot of people have had very bad experiences with them. And actually, if you see there, if you type in "why are chatbots" on Google, one of the suggested responses is "why are chatbots so bad?" So there seems to be this kind of perception that chatbots are annoying. They're kind of a barrier between a customer and the support that they need from a real person. And there's a nice little example here from Twitter that I'll just share with you that kind of brings to life the bad experience that people have often had.
Hi, welcome to our customer support chat. How might we help you today? Hi, yes, I'm looking for an answer on a very specific issue that I can't answer on your website. Can you help me answer this question? I don't understand that query. However, I can list back the entire website's navigation to you so that you can choose the navigation item you'd like to select. No, actually, could you help answer this specific question? Or perhaps could you send me to a customer service representative instead? I don't understand that query. However, what I can do is give you a list of options and questions to select from that are already addressed on our website. Would you like that instead? No, could you just please connect me with a customer support person? I see you'd like to contact customer support. You can contact them using the phone number below or by emailing them directly. Okay.
So yeah, a nice example there of how chatbots can be a hindrance more than help. And it's not just kind of anecdotal evidence that conversational AI and chatbots are not necessarily making the impact that they could do. If you're familiar with the hype cycle from Gartner, they publish this every year, and it basically shows people's expectations about new technologies over time. So you start with an innovation trigger when a new technology becomes available. It gets massively hyped. And you go up to this peak of inflated expectations where people have very, very high hopes about the technology. But then oftentimes it's more difficult than it seems to get it working correctly, to get it to kind of deliver real value. So we plunge down into the trough of disillusionment. And then if we're lucky, everyone's expectations are kind of balanced a bit, and we come up this slope of enlightenment to the plateau of productivity, where the technology becomes more widely adopted, and people's expectations are better matched with the capabilities of the technology. And the 2021 hype cycle for natural language technologies actually puts virtual assistants, conversational AI platforms, and chatbots slipping down into that trough of disillusionment. So very much they were overhyped over the last few years. People are now coming crashing back down to earth, and they're finding it a bit disappointing in reality. It's not really meeting their expectations. And there's a nice quote here from Gartner that says, "The market is awash with low-end virtual assistants that deliver a poor user experience, create friction, and don't deliver business benefit." So it sounds like there's real trouble here. And I like this GIF showing that chatbots are only as smart as the people who build them. And you could also say they're only as good as the people who design them. So even though there's been lots of advances in AI and voice technology, it means that many companies are turning to conversational interfaces to communicate with customers, especially, like I said, at the outbreak of the pandemic. But a technology first approach means that many of these interactions are frustrating, they're not successful, and they're not really conversational at all. So really, I'd say over the last few years, there's been way too much focus on the tech and not nearly enough focus on the design. Because, yeah, the technology's become so accessible. Everyone can just build a chatbot, put it live in a few days. But if you neglect the actual kind of customer or user at the center of that who's going to be using the chatbot, then it's never going to be a big success. So this is where the world of conversation design comes in. And conversation design is all about creating those interactions between humans and machines. So by machines, we mean chatbots, voice assistants, any kind of conversational agents. And it should be based on how people have conversations in real life. So inspired by human voice, inspired by natural language. And conversation design involves several different design disciplines, actually, including interaction design, visual design, audio design, UX writing. And conversation designers are the practitioners of this craft. So they foster good relationships between people and machines, always starting with what people need and how they use language to express their needs. And conversation designers curate the conversation. So they outline its flow, the underlying logic in a design specification that covers the whole end-to-end user experience. So it's a really interesting field that's kind of emerged in the last few years. And conversation design is kind of at the intersection of various different skills. So you see here, it's kind of a combination of bits of interaction design, bits of process analysis, bits of UX writing or content design, also bits of UX research. And actually, some of the best conversation designers come from quite unusual backgrounds, but it's easy to see why their previous work translated well into the field of conversation design. So, for example, people who've maybe acted as a counselor or a psychologist, they make really good conversation designers because they're good at asking questions and guiding a person to a resolution. And a copywriter or content designer who's worked on websites and other kind of digital channels is often the most common choice for a conversation designer because there's a lot of crossovers between creating content for other digital channels and for chatbots. And when it comes to writing dialogues, you need to have a very analytical and structured mindset, bringing that kind of logical thought for bringing order to chaos and finding the most streamlined path through it. So how do you actually design that step-by-step conversational pathway so that it creates a kind of streamlined user experience? And chatbots who have big personalities, which is often a big part of it, They're typically involve a comedian or a script writer. We actually have someone that joined our team recently who used to be a screenwriter. And yeah, obviously they're really good at understanding dialogue and the nuances of language. So people do come from a very diverse set of backgrounds, but like I said, it's this combination of different skills that makes a good conversation designer. And basically, a conversation designer's job is to think about what people need. So there's some kind of research aspects to that, as well as obviously empathy. They think about how people use language to express their needs. So there's some kind of linguistic elements needed there. And also they need to think about how people take in information. So again, following a lot of principles from content design in terms of how do you present information in a way that it's as easy and effective as possible for the user to understand. And thinking about what a conversation designer is actually going to be doing in their day-to-day job, just to give you a bit of a flavor. This is a kind of project lifecycle methodology that we follow at Accenture, going through all of those different stages of the project from discovery to into describe, design, build, and run. And just some of the main kind of highlights in terms of activities and outcomes from these different stages. In that discover phase, it's all about the research, understanding who the user is, what their needs are, also doing things like interviewing stakeholders for the company who's building the chatbot, again, to understand what their priorities are, what their pain points are, what the business needs are to make sure that it's also addressing those. Doing some mapping of the different systems and the channels which are used in order to reach customers at the moment with kind of real human agents in the contact center. And we also can do what we call a market conversation scan. So kind of looking for other examples of chatbots that are being used by similar companies or competitors to see how they're handling that at the moment. So we can do a bit of a benchmarking exercise. And some of the outcomes of this phase are going to be things like an as-is conversation matrix. So what are the different conversations that users are having with the company through any existing channels. And we can also start piecing together some personas and what we call personas. So not just your typical user, but actually where they are during the point at which they're contacting the organization. So are they at home? Are they traveling? Are they hands-free because they're busy in the kitchen or something like that? Once we have a good idea of that, we can move on to our describe phase where we start actually defining what the future state is going to be about. So the conversation designer is going to be driving a lot of work around workshops for generating those ideas about the to-be scenario, doing some exploration around the personality for the chatbot, which is hugely important. Research has shown that people, just by human nature, we ascribe a personality to anything that speaks to us. So if you don't define a personality and build that intentionally, then your users will kind of attribute their own assumptions of a personality. So it's important to kind of preempt that and build a personality that fits the brand. We can also start doing things like some paper prototyping and storyboarding to bring to life what some of those future conversations might look like. And some of the outputs from that are things like the to-be conversation map. So what are all of the different types of conversations? How do they fit together? That helps you do some prioritization of where you can get started. And we can also come up with some conversation storyboards to kind of visualize what that user experience is going to be like. Once that's all done, we can move on to our design phase. So it's important here to start thinking when we're designing the kind of detailed dialogues, how do we make those inclusive? So again, by using our personas, understanding who those users are, different demographics, how can we make them accessible and inclusive, both in terms of the language that we're using, in terms of various different accessibility guidelines that we might need to follow. This is where we really come into the personality design as well. So going into more detail of the chatbot's personality, what are the behaviors, what are the type of tone of voice, vocabulary that it's going to be using. Actually structuring the conversation itself. So a big part of the conversation design is mapping out that back and forth dialogue between the user and the chatbot, and kind of what happens, how does the chatbot respond when it gets asked a particular question, what happens if the user deviates from one of the pathways that you've anticipated. And a good way of informing that is by doing things like prototyping, user testing to get early feedback and kind of course correct if necessary. And the things that can come out of that design phase are things like the definition of the chatbot personality, which can then in turn feed into a style guide when you're writing the dialogue, and the detailed conversation flow design. So like I said, how does the different pathways go if you're mapping out that dialogue between the user and the bot. Then we can jump into our build phase, and that's all really about doing ongoing usability testing, iterating on the design based on feedback. We can also start thinking about some future features that we might want to add, prioritizing those into a backlog. And a big one that we always want to do is a bit of an ethical audit, making sure that any assumptions we've made about how the bot will behave, about how it will understand people from different backgrounds, we are treating those in a way that is kind of in accordance with our own code of ethics that we've defined earlier in the project. There's been a lot of bad press for certain chatbots about stereotyping in terms of the bot's persona, reinforcing negative gender stereotypes, also in terms of the language models that the bot uses to understand users, having kind of intrinsic bias in them and not understanding people with certain accents or from certain demographics. So we think it's very important to have a checkpoint at regular points through the kind of implementation of the bot to make sure that we're not falling into any pitfalls from an ethics perspective. And then in terms of the outcomes from there, we have things like our finalized design for the whole end-to-end conversation. And in parallel, we'll have a roadmap with some of the future development opportunities for the bot. And then when we go into run, when the chatbot goes live, there's going to need to be ongoing monitoring of how it's performing, optimizing how the bot is performing. So are users responding well to the answers that the chatbot is providing? Do people understand the way that we've crafted those answers? Are any people getting into difficulties at certain points of the conversation? Is there anything we need to improve from that perspective? And so we can do all of those tuning and refinement activities through there, as well as starting to build some of the new features from the backlog. And one of the outcomes there is going to be some feedback around how the chatbot is performing. So hopefully we can prove to the organization that it's got a positive impact and it's not providing one of those very negative experiences that are sometimes perceived. So that's a little overview of the type of stuff that a conversation designer would be doing throughout a project. Hopefully that's been interesting. Just to sum up, why should you consider becoming a conversation designer? The reason I like it is because it's this kind of fusion of art and science. So you've got the kind of creativity side of things in terms of creating the personality, crafting the dialogue, using words in a very effective way. But it's also got the science aspect in terms of understanding the way that people tick from the psychology perspective, but also kind of mapping out the logical side of the different pathways through the conversation. So if you're interested in anything like that, then conversation design could be an interesting option for you to pursue. But also it's a very in-demand area. So the market is growing super fast. If we go back to this Algorithmia report, they predict that, there's going to be $14 billion industry around conversational AI by 2025. So an annual growth of 22%. So it's getting bigger and bigger. And there's obviously going to be more and more need for designers to get involved in those projects. They anticipate that the volume of interactions handled by conversational agents that increased by as much as 250% in multiple industries during 2020. Again, during COVID, like I said, that really ramped up. 75% of organizations prioritize artificial intelligence, machine learning over other IT initiatives. So there's a big focus on rolling out this technology. And business leaders said that conversational agents have increased their sales by 67%. So basically, conversational AI is here to stay, and we're going to need designers to actually create a good experience. Gartner also have a nice quote saying that by 2022, 20% of large enterprises will have dedicated dialogue designers as part of their user experience teams, from under 1% in 2019. So certainly there's going to be a very big demand for conversation designers, and we need you. There's going to be massive demand, and there's a big opportunity to get involved in this area. So if you are interested in finding out a bit more about conversation design, I've got a couple of recommended resources that you can have a look at. This book is absolutely amazing. It's like my Bible. It's called Conversations with Things by Diana Deibel and Rebecca Evanholm. Could very, very strongly recommend having a look at this book. It kind of covers the whole end-to-end process of conversation design. There's also an organization called the Conversation Design Institute, who have a load of really detailed training about conversation design in general, but also kind of sub-specialisms within that in terms of conversational copywriting, actual training of the AI. So again, if you're interested in finding out a bit more, I recommend having a look at that. Otherwise, that's it for me. My details are there. If you want to know more, you're interested in learning more about conversation design, please do drop me a line. Happy to have a separate chat about it. So thank you very much for listening to my talk. That's it. Cheers.